Hello and welcome to Digital Marketing Talk. This is a podcast that shows you actionable tips on how you can grow your business. My name is Shola Matthew, and today we are exploring a medium that's not just for entertainment but has become a powerhouse in marketing. And we are talking about nothing else than podcast. So let's get started. Now, some people who might not know what podcast is might be wondering what exactly is podcasting, or how do you get into podcasts and all of that. But I want to tell you that if you are here listening to what I'm saying right now, you're listening to what is called a podcast. Okay? Podcasts have transformed from a niche medium into a mainstream marketing tool. Why? This is because podcasts offer a unique blend of intimacy, authority, and reach. Today, we are going to look into how brands are leveraging podcasting for marketing and how you too can do the same. So, why do you have to use podcasts for marketing? You see, firstly, podcasts allow for a personal connection. I remember the first podcast I listened to. I think it's about a message. Basically, it's a Christian message on marriage, and I listened to that podcast several times, such that I became acquainted with, the voice of the podcaster. And several years later, right, I think I met my wife eventually. When I first listened to the podcast, I listened to it while I was in the university. And several years later, I met my wife. And one day we're just talking about something. And guess what? This same podcast came into play. And I said, this must be the man, because I have listened to his podcast before. At the time, I didn't even really know the name of that podcaster. But, by the time my wife and I were discussing, and I realized that it is the same person that I've been listening to for years. I mean, not for years, but, at that time. So it forms a personal connection for listeners, and because listeners especially choose to listen to podcasts. And this is because listeners can listen to podcasts anywhere in the world at any time that they choose to. Some people listen to podcasts while they're driving in the car. Some people listen to podcasts when they want to sleep. Some people listen to podcasts when they are exercising or when they are working. So podcast is actually amazing. Like I said earlier, it's not just for entertainment. It's now become a marketing tool. So I want to share with you a few things on how you can use podcasts for marketing. You understand? So the first thing is you can use podcasts for brand building. Through storytelling, brands like yours can establish a voice and personality, making them relatable. One of the podcasts I love listening to is Marketing Podcast by Neil Patel and his partner, and that podcast is quite amazing. Okay, it helps them to build the brand that has become a very powerful brand today. And some of you might know this podcast, The Diary of a CEO, and that is also a podcast that has helped Steven, to become a very powerful brand today. So podcasts can help you build your brand, especially if you know how to tell stories. Stories can help you to create a powerful brand for your podcast. Another thing is content diversification. So for instance, let's say you have a website that you blog on for your business, and then you have a YouTube channel for your business as well. You can take one or two videos or any of the videos, and turn them to podcasts. Or maybe you already have blog posts, a library of blog posts. Do you know that you can turn them to podcasts? And one amazing tool I want to share with you today that you can use to turn all your blog posts to podcasts is Flex Clip. Okay, this is an amazing tool. So you don't necessarily need to even record your podcast by yourself. So you can just turn those blog posts, take them to AI tools like Grok or ChatGPT or Gemini or Cloud and just tell them, hey, turn this into a podcast. All right. So once they turn it to a podcast, then you now take those words, you now paste them into Flex Clip, and Flex Clip can turn your text file into audio file, thereby creating the podcast. By the way, I'm not using Flex Clip to create this video. To create this podcast right now. Okay, I'm using my voice. You're listening to my voice, but it's something that you can explore for your business. Now, you can use podcasts even for direct marketing, subtle product placements, sponsored content, and calls to action can integrate naturally into podcasts. For instance, let's say that FlexClip now had paid me money to, include their product into this podcast that you're listening to today. By the way, they did not tell me to talk about them today. I just chose to do that. But assuming that they've done that, it's quite easy for you to go and try out this tool just because I mentioned it in the podcast today. So with this, you can use even podcasts for direct marketing, which is quite amazing. All right. Now let's look at some of the success stories on how podcasts, can help your business grow. So recently I got emails about people wanting to be on my podcast, and also I got emails about people who want to promote stuff on my podcast, on my videos and all of that. Now, this is something that you can also do because podcasts can be an opportunity for you to also earn an extra income for yourself. Now, let me share with you a case study of how you can use podcasts for marketing. Stephen Bartlett, right, the host of Diary of a CEO, is now recognized as a British entrepreneur, but he started with podcasting. And through his podcast, he began to interview several people, several CEOs, where they tell their stories. And before you know it, his podcast grew exponentially, becoming one of the top podcasts in the world. And he eventually went ahead to write a book called Diary of a CEO. Can you see what we're talking about now? So he is able to, build a brand with that, and today he's getting business deals. A lot of people reaching out to him, businesses. He even partners with Fiverr recently, marketing for Fiverr. So this is something that podcasts can help you to do. Now, if you want to start a podcast, you might be wondering, how can I start a podcast? If you are considering starting a podcast for your brand, I would advise you to define your niche. What unique value can you offer? So say you are into the health niche, all right? You might want to look at, are you going to be talking about all types of health, or are you going to be talking about, weight loss? Basically, look at how your business is and then position your business to provide a unique value. Okay. The next thing you want to do is choose your format. Do you want to go solo? For example, this is what we call a solo podcast. You are listening to me talk alone on this podcast. That is a solo. Or do you want to do interviews? So maybe you want to interview your customers or people or experts that can bring value to your audience. That is also something that you want to do. Or maybe you want to do roundtables, maybe have more people who are going to be talking or discussing on a podcast, or you can actually combine one or two together. So just choose a format. The next thing you want to do is script. Okay, so why some people prefer a full script, okay, all that's up for an outline. So for example, someone like me, I love to have an outline and just flow naturally on my podcast. But there are some people that have a full script of their podcast, so anything that you hear them say is what they've already written down. Now, how do you want to engage your listeners? That is something that you also want to consider. Encourage listeners' interaction through social media, calls to action for reviews, or joining a community. For example, I'll invite you right now to follow me on this podcast, like it, and share with other people so that they can also enjoy what you're currently enjoying. All right. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can make money with podcasting. All right. So it's not just about ads. Some people run adverts on podcasts. For example, if you are running your podcast on Spotify, and you are in the US, you can enable ads on your podcast. However, it's not just about ads. You can also get business to talk on your podcast. So, it's more like a sponsorship where they sponsor your podcast and you get paid on that. And not just that, okay. Another way by which you can make money from your podcast is you can get donations from listeners. All right. By the way, if you want to donate to our podcast, let us know by reaching out to us via our email or by visiting my social media platform, Shola Matthew, and we also accept donation. And another thing you can do is you can sell a product. So say you have a digital product or you have a physical product, you can sell it on your podcast. Yeah, so just like any other platform, podcasts also have their own analytics. So you can check your analytics to see how people are interacting with your podcast, which of your content are performing the best, so that you can create more content like that, or you can see, okay, what do you need to do to become better at podcasting. And finally, please do not stop listening to podcasts. If you want to be a great podcast, one of the ways to get started being a great podcaster is actually to listen to other podcasts. So you can have your podcast on platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and so on and so forth. And I do hope that you've gained something from today's podcast. If you have any question whatsoever, please remember you can always reach out to me on Twitter. For example, I am Global Shola, so that's my Twitter handle, and you can also send me an email, info@sholamatthew.com. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope that you share this podcast with other people so that they can benefit from it.